You'll be off, Drew, I think. Okay, so I'll stop the recording, Drew, when we finished. Okay, so thanks very much, Drew. And Jessie, I'm going to stop sharing. So you can share your screen.
Cool, thank you. And
I hope that wasn't too traumatic, your end.
Oh, this is a fun time with technology. Okay, can everybody see that? Okay.
Yep. Yeah, that's great. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Cool, so I'm good to go?
Yeah.
Amazing. So thank you everyone for being so patient with me. I'm currently on holiday in the UK and using my friend's laptop and technology, and it's all going swimmingly, as you may be able to tell, but hopefully nothing else happens, and bear with me as well while I'm in my holiday mindset. I'll try and come out of it for this time with you, but if I seem weird or can't get my words out, that's why. But today I'm going to be talking to you about how to conserve conservationists. I am the founder of the online global community Lonely Conservationists, and I'll talk a lot about my life and how I got to found this community within my presentation, so I'll just get straight into it. Cool. So I am from Australia, and Australia is a colonized country. And for this reason, it's really important for me to both acknowledge and thank First Nations people and their knowledge, wisdom, and practices that exist as a foundation of global conservation efforts. I pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging from wherever the lands you are on, and recognize that a lot of conservation techniques come from the first people of many different nations. And it's really important as a conservationist to recognize where these efforts, knowledge, and wisdom comes from. So this was me, a representation of me and my life as a conservationist in January in 2019. I was so burnt out, sad, mopey on the couch. I was thinking that I was going to have to give up on being a conservationist and instead become a trophy wife, because I just felt like I couldn't hack it in the conservation industry. But to show you what my life was like up until that point, let's get into what my experience was in trying to be a conservationist. So here's a picture of me with Sputnik, my stuffed toy gorilla that I was given when I was 3 years old. And it sparked this innate curiosity in me about primates in the natural world, and especially how similar primates were to us. I could recognize how their hands and face and ears were like mine. And it got me really curious and to learn and to read books and to ask a lot of questions. Until I was 5 years old, and I asked my mum the big question, how I could save the orangutans, because I was learning about the cousins of the gorillas, the orangutans, and how they were exposed to oil palm plantations and bushmeat trade and a lot of other detriments that they were facing. And as a toddler, I couldn't really understand how I was not able to make a mess without cleaning it up, but the same wasn't expected for adults. So I kind of was set on this trajectory to answer that question of how I could conserve these habitats. So because of this, I had blinkers on. I needed to conserve natural habitats. I spent 5 years at an agricultural and horticultural school, so I could understand what it meant to produce food and to manage land. And then 3 years in a biodiversity and conservation undergraduate degree, where I got some practical hands-on skills as well as some theory. And then I spent 1 year in an honors degree in ecology and environmental science. And that's actually where I was able to go to Indonesia and study the spatial ecology of orangutans within newly restored forest habitats. So I was always told that I wasn't able to just study and then get a job. So I tried to get as much experience as I could to get a robust perception of what conservation was. So I volunteered for grassroots conservation projects across 7 different countries, and I lived in Madagascar studying for 6 months, Madagascar working actually as an assistant research officer, and then studying in Indonesia for 6 months. And across that time, I studied lemurs, orangutans, elephants, birds, reptiles, frogs, and insects. And I really wanted to get a scope of what it was like to understand the full ecosystem rather than just species. I really wanted my knowledge to be as comprehensive as possible, as localized as possible, and to really understand what goes into conservation. after a while, I really felt like I was becoming someone in the industry. I was presenting my research at international conferences, and I was winning awards for presentations in my research and building an international professional network. And it felt so amazing to be recognized for the research that I was doing after all these years of understanding how important that research was. So considering all the hard effort and work that I put into my career, why was this my career at age 26? It's because my passion had been exploited during this time. I was always told that people couldn't afford to pay me because it was a generally underfunded industry. There was dangling carrot opportunities, such as if you put in this amount of effort and work, then we will give you some kind of reward for it, either monetarily or career-wise, after you do all the work, but that never comes and never eventuates. And there was always the mantra that I couldn't get a job without volunteering. But honestly, how many hours of volunteering would I have to put in to be able to get a job? It's really ridiculous. And I always think about this. If I was a bricklayer, would I be expected to lay bricks for a decade for free before I get paid to build a house? Like, it just doesn't happen in a lot of other industries. When I finally was paid for work, there was a lot of really toxic management, and I was working for a lot of family businesses where there was no unions or higher ups to take issues to. So sometimes I'd have a really good title and a really amazing job that I was happy with, but because of disagreements with bosses, I just had to quit my job. And then I had to start from scratch again. And even when I was earning money and I was paying, even when I was earning money and working, I still couldn't pay my bills. So I had a layer of financial insecurity and financial stress on top of the career stress and the volunteering and everything else that I was doing. So this eventuated in a lot of mental health impacts that resulted from a lot of work for a very little reward. These included burnout, where I just felt like I couldn't function anymore and I couldn't put in the effort anymore. Imposter syndrome, where you feel like a fraud for being in a space where you actually know quite a lot. And post-traumatic stress disorder, which comes from experiencing a lot of stress and having an extended amount of symptoms as a result. And this is because I never saw anybody else struggling in the industry, so I didn't know that it was a common situation. Social media only showed the good parts of the industry, and the other people that I knew in conservation were flying across the world, showing pictures of amazing animals they were working with and amazing landscapes and sunsets. And I was really struggling for a lot of aspects that I wasn't seeing reflected in my peers and colleagues. Conservation was always glamorized in the media. So David Attenborough documentaries or National Geographic, it was the same thing where it was a lot of like, oh, look at this amazing stuff and look at what they're doing in these animals and all these success stories. There's a picture of me researching after getting caught in an illegal snake trap. And I actually have a chronically bad ankle now that is going to be bad for the rest of my life because of that. And these are things that nobody was talking about. And there was also kind of the social implication of having too many cool experiences to be allowed to complain. So from the other side, all the people that thought I was experiencing the amazing wildlife and amazing landscapes, they didn't think that I was able to complain about the bad bits because I had a privilege to have the rest of it that seemed amazing and not a usual life for a lot of people. So there I was on my couch, undervalued, underpaid, and isolated. And I was like that for like half a day until my friend messaged me from Malaysia saying that she was having trouble getting permits to go back. She was actually in Spain and she needed to complete her research in Malaysia on elephants, and she was finding it hard to get the permits, and she was stuck and she was isolated. And so I wondered, could I really be the only one feeling this way? And so I went onto the internet and I started writing about my experience, and I titled the blog that I created, Lonely Conservationist, because at that time I felt like the loneliest conservationist in the world, kind of hoping that somebody out there would tell me if they resonated or if they felt like they could relate, or if I was truly the only one experiencing hardship in the conservation industry. And all of a sudden, I wasn't so alone anymore. So after I published my story, hundreds of other conservationists from around the world started telling their stories as well. And I realized all these similarities. And before we knew it, we had over 100 lonely conservationists sharing their stories online. We were able to come together and resonate with each other and build a community that is now over 6,000 lonely conservationists strong. So definitely not alone anymore. And through this, I'd accidentally started a really important conversation where I was interviewed by Australian Geographic and Mongabay and the ABC, and all these different podcasts wanted to have a conversation about this. And it was really bewildering because I had not been talking about this for so long and keeping it inside and silently suffering. And all of a sudden I was expected to talk about it very publicly. And it was a very surreal experience, but obviously a lot of people resonated with this. So I decided to take the conversation further and put in everything I'd learned throughout establishing the community in a cohesive story, and tell the story of how we can conserve conservationists and help ourselves. And if we have conservationists in our lives, help them out as well. And then we had the sequel to the book, I guess, which was a compilation of blogs and stories from people in our community and publishing them and their stories in The Secret Life of Conservationists to kind of have a realistic perception of what it is like to be a conservationist across the world. And we also did a podcast as well. I was talking with my husband, who is an IT nerd, not in conservation at all, but I really wanted to have that dynamic conversation about what it was like from my perspective as a conservationist and his perspective of what conservation was like from an outsider, and have a dynamic conversation that kind of sees it from both sides. So now to address the important conversation, the question in the room: how do we conserve conservationists? Well, it's really important to de-glorify the industry and to treat all conservationists as humans. I've been in really dangerous and life-threatening situations that weren't given the gravitas or respect that they deserve because they sound so fantastical. Like the time that I almost got killed by an orangutan or chased by a tiger, they aren't normal situations to be in, so they're often glorified, which may sound like to the person that it's happening to that people are okay with your potential death being used as a fantastical story. And I've also had these near-death experiences of mine being used as clickbait in the media or from people who want to promote their podcasts. And it's not really okay to use somebody's traumatic experience as a piece of clickbait and something that you can benefit from. So risk assessments and making sure everyone's safe should be a high priority, regardless of what the situation is, if it's an animal attack or if it's a motorbike accident. We need to pay and treat workers fairly for the work they're doing. And I think this is a really interesting situation since lockdown, where a lot of the people who are collecting seeds for nurseries, and they were really skilled in collecting the right seeds and growing Indigenous plants and having that knowledge. A lot of people realized that that was really valuable in lockdown when they didn't have a lot of volunteers working in that space anymore. But what if we were actually paying and supporting these people with highly valuable skills and knowledge to be able to continue on their work? So I think there's a difference in value to what we are willing to financially support, and I think that definitely has to change. There's a lot of highly skilled conservationists, and we need to be prioritizing them having a sustainable life and them being able to fund themselves and pay the bills. There's also the important point of destigmatizing mental health. I was suffering with PTSD for 4 years before I even knew that I was suffering with it. It wasn't until I received a blog for the website and I really resonated with the story. So I reached out to the conservationists who wrote it to talk to them more. And I found out that they were suffering with PTSD. And it wasn't until I had seen my experiences reflected in this story that I understood what I was going through. Because before I thought it was just war veterans that went through PTSD, and I didn't know it could be anybody, especially from the conservation industry, that could go through with that. So just destigmatizing it and making services available for people when they need it. We also need to open the gate and promote inclusivity. Conservation requires a lot of people to volunteer and work for free, which is not accessible to everybody. People need to be able to feed their families and pay the bills. And unless you're from a very privileged background, it's hard to do that. And sometimes they call conservation a trust fund baby industry because you kind of need to have a certain level of security to be able to participate in it. And that needs to change because there's so many valuable opinions and skills and backgrounds that are really relevant to conserving our natural spaces. We also need to expect colleagues to have a life outside of conservation and destigmatize rest. I suffered with rest guilt for a long time. And then I sat with myself and realized that if I wasn't rested and if I'm always burnt out, then there's not much that I can do to constructively help our natural spaces and the people and wildlife. So every time somebody tells me that they've taken a nap or watched Selling Sunset or other trashy TV, I congratulate them, give them a big hug, because that's so important. And we need to foster a safe, inclusive environment to talk about when things are not going wrong. It's really, really hard to be failure positive, and I'll talk about this a bit soon. It's really hard to be upfront and honest in a workplace if it's a very toxic atmosphere. To have that supportive, healthy environment, we need to feel safe enough to share what's going wrong as well as what's going right. And yeah, I have it here, adopt a failure positive attitude. In conservation, we need to be sharing and learning from our mistakes. Imagine a world where there's a conference where everyone was sharing what went wrong, so we could use the limited funding and resources to put towards things that we know will work because they've been tested by other people. As long as we pretend that everything's going perfectly all the time, it's really hard to make genuine improvements to the wildlife and ecosystems that we're working so hard to protect. So adopting a failure positive attitude is something that I think is really important within businesses and organizations and NGOs, but also more broadly throughout the industry. Finding your community is something that's literally saved my life. I thought I was the loneliest conservationist in the world, and now every single person that I meet from the community is immediately my best friend, and we connect on this level that, I don't know, everything's so easy and amazing, and I don't have to prove myself to anybody or over-explain things or justify myself. And it's just so refreshing to be in a space where everyone's understood. And I think finding that is something that is integral to your life as a conservationist, and I can't hype that up enough. And then the last one is give ourselves permission to rest and know that we're more than our imposter syndrome tells us we are. I've been in conferences where people have asked, oh, Jessie, what do you do? Where are you from? And because I haven't said a specific university or a specific prestigious business or NGO, I've been dismissed straight away. But I need to understand that I was asked or given the opportunity, or I am at that space. So my opinion is worthy and my experience is worthy. And I think a hack for getting over imposter syndrome is to understand that your experience and perceptions and knowledge is always going to be different. And that's always good. Even if you have a panel of elite scientists that are specialists, the fact that you are coming in with a normal person's opinion or somebody from the outside or just a general member of public, that's super important. And if you get too insular, then you're missing a whole heap of important perspectives. So understand that no matter how we're perceived, that our opinion, skills, and knowledge is really important and valuable. So what is my life now as a conservationist? Because I'm definitely not on the couch anymore unless I'm taking a nap. So I actually have my first ever, as of 2-3 months ago, have my first ever paid full-time job in the industry, which is wild. I was, ever since starting Lonely Conservationist, which was 4 years ago, I was gradually able to move up in the career chain, or like, I don't have words today, but I was working for 2 years in a job that was 4 days a week, and now I'm up to 5 days a week. And it's just so amazing how I thought that creating this community was going to limit all and every opportunity in the conservation sector for me. I thought that by telling my story, I was chucking it all away and I was never going to have any opportunities ever again. So it's so insane to me that I'm now able to support myself and have savings and have a comfortable life in this industry. And I still get to work on Lonely Conservationists on the side as my passion project, continuing to empower a community of over 6,000 global conservationists. And there's a picture of me speaking to the National Landcare Network in Tasmania last year, where I was able to help real life conservationists take a step back and think about how they were going to sustain themselves and conserve and look after themselves. And that was really incredible. And of course, in my spare time, I like to do modeling shoots with birds, especially ducks. So my time in the UK so far, I've seen 69 bird species, and that's something that gives me a lot of zest and joy in the world. And so I'd like to end with some important notes that your career and personal well-being will only improve by advocating for yourself. And I thought that by advocating for myself, I'll be limiting opportunities, because the industry, I always perceived it to expect perfection and to want me to be as flawless as possible, because there's so much competition and so little people who get the opportunities to do the job. I can't ever advocate for myself. I just have to be a yes man. But I've found since creating Lonely Conservationist that every time I advocate for myself, I actually make myself look more valuable. So for context, I applied for a job to be a bush candy facilitator, like kindergarten in the bush. It's something we do in Australia. In 2021. And basically they said, yeah, you can have the job, we'll give you minimum wage. And I basically sent them an email saying, I think I'm worth more than minimum wage, here's all my expertise. And it turned out that my boss said later to me that she respected me more and gave me more opportunities because I was so confident in myself. She felt like she could trust me to deliver really good sessions to the kindergartners. So I think that really taught me that I can advocate myself, and actually it's in my best interest to advocate for myself. It's really important to understand that you're not alone. If you feel alone and maybe you don't have your own community, you now have Lonely Conservationists, you now have me to relate to you, and feel free to reach out, message, email, contact me anytime. I just need you to know that conservation as a career is really challenging, but you don't have to do it alone anymore. And people are changing. I see now some people sending me screenshots of these like turtle volunteering opportunities in Fiji or whatever. And a lot of people underneath being like, leaving comments saying, just have a look at how much is expected of you and how much you get in return. And is this actually worth it from a cultural perspective, a conservation perspective, and for your own well-being perspective as well. So I think the fact that people are talking about this and thinking about this more means that there is starting to be more pressure on the industry to make these positive changes that are much needed. And that's it from me. Here is the website, how to contact me, my Instagram and Twitter. And yeah, thank you so much for listening. And if you have any questions, I would love to continue this conversation, find out about if you can relate and if you've been in this, if you felt lonely or burnt out in conservation, and maybe some of your coping strategies as well. So thank you so much for listening, and I'm keen to continue this discussion.
Thanks so much, Jessie. That was great. That very familiar as a lecturer, supporting students. The number of my students who've gone out into the world of conservation, with good field skills. They've done maybe 3 summers working for consultancies on 0-hours contracts, being laid off at the end of every season, having to go and work in shops. And after a few years, they give up and go and do something else. And yeah, volunteering and 0-hours contracts, I think, are really big problems for our industry here. Has anyone got any questions, any comments? Go for it, Paul.
Jessie, that was absolutely outstanding. And it was, listening to it, it was joyful and life-giving and supportive. And I'm really, I just think it was wonderful. And I'll be quite clear, you know, I'm towards the end of my career. So Paul Rooney, RIP, retirement in progress. But over that period of time, I've worked both in nature conservation, coastal conservation, and for the last nearly 25 years in academia. And I've had 2 periods when I've burnt out, and not like had self-care. And I can say, I remember looking back at an old colleague of mine who used to stop in the day and have a 20-minute, half an hour sleep in the office. And at that time, I thought it was terrible. It was awful. But looking back on it now, it actually meant that that person could be super productive afterwards if they did that type of thing. And I think I think I don't know your experience of it, that toxic culture of performance, sadly in academia, I think with things like research outputs and publish or die attitudes and things, it's just awful. It's not a question, it's a comment, you know. And so what you said, isn't there a self-care attitude here as well? And you need to get your local networks going.
For sure. And somebody once told me a story about, like, there was a wood chopping competition, and it was like these 2 guys had to cut as many wood logs as they could in a certain amount of time, and one guy kept disappearing every hour on the hour, and the other guy's like, what's happening? Isn't he taking it seriously? But then that guy ended up chopping the most amount of wood, because when he was going off every hour, he was sharpening his axe. And I think that's something that we don't really consider, is like, we need to be working smarter, not harder, and we need to be taking the time to sharpen our axe so we can cut the most amount of wood. And I think after hearing that story, I was like, like, what are we doing if we're just working with blunt tools? Like, we have to consider that mentality with ourselves as well. Anybody else got any questions?
I think hi Jessie. I just say great. I think that's such a great message to put out. I've been told in my career, like, oh, you can't get married, you can't have a baby, you can't take a break, you need to do this, so and so is publishing this, and and I think when you're vulnerable and you're trying to establish things, you take it all literally. Like, I used to be like, oh God, I better be that way, and yeah, I think it's just such a good message to send out, and yeah, really great to give people confidence to say, yeah, I am work, I do know stuff. Yeah, I've done lots of, I've also been dismissed in the past, but you've just done loads of voluntary stuff. You've not done proper conservation. It's like, well, I've still learned things, and I've worked really hard. And so, yeah, I just echo what you say. I just think it's great that, and also the failure thing as well. My PhD, I've done quite a bit of stuff on failure, and even now in industry, people don't want to talk about it, and it really, I'm trying to push that as well. So again, brilliant to be pushing that forward. So thank you.
Thanks, Gemma. And you kind of highlighted a point there that there's extra pressures on women as well, and I think that kind of impacts us when we go through the industry. And some people have given me feedback that they lent my book to someone that's like maybe an older established male, and they're like, this is kind of stupid because I never experienced any of this. And it's like, well, that's fine, but that wasn't my experience, and that's not a lot of people's experience. And there was also like a weird situation with toxic masculinity, where I was like asking my community why there was a lot of women happy to contribute to the blog but not a lot of men. And they were saying that they would get judged for speaking out on topics like this, or some people would comment to them like, you have a job, why you're not allowed to complain about it. So I think there's a lot of gendered issues as well in conservation. There's actually a study released in Australia really recently, I'm pretty sure it was in Australia, saying that conservation industry was worse for women, but men perceived it to be better for women than women perceived it to be. So it's really challenging if you have I guess, like, if there's male CEOs and managers, and then everybody else is like a lot of women working for free or volunteering because they've got children to look after, or they can't commit to the hours or do hard yakka bush work. There's those kind of limitations in there as well. So a really interesting point, because I know that my lecturers would always apologize, female lecturers would apologize to us being like, oh, we couldn't publish between this date and this date because we were raising children. It's like, well, that shouldn't be a problem, and that shouldn't hinder you. That's just a part of your life. That, I don't know, the pressure to publish and how you're like impacted by that is horrific.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, I did have a baby during my PhD, but it wasn't easy, and there was a lot of comments like, well, you did choose to have a child over this and over that, and it's like, well, and that was from male, people that, yeah. So it was tough, but yeah, hopefully that's changed. I know in other countries it's not. My friend's in Sweden, and she was actually told this is a great time to start a family when you're a PhD student. So,
oh, well, we wouldn't say that now, and we have visa issues and goodness knows what with overseas students and pregnancies kicking off at the moment. Jessie, I can remember in one of our conversations, we talked about the fact that you shouldn't put your age on your CV, because if you're perceived to be a woman of childbearing age, then that can go against you in terms of being offered a permanent job. I mean, there are all of these things that men just don't have. But what do we think about things like the expectation of volunteering? I mean, I always told my students not to volunteer. and that if they were going to consider volunteering, they needed to have an outcome plan. So if you go and do this volunteering, what is it going to give you in terms of adding to your CV? And if you haven't got that tangible outcome, don't do it, because to what extent is the army of volunteers that are being encouraged, some by their universities, some by organisations, to what extent are they limiting the number of jobs available for other people? And what do we think about 0 hours contracts? Something I've raised with Saeem fairly regularly.
Yeah, I think it's just, I don't know, it frustrates me because I was always told in my university days, like, I'll never get a career without volunteering. But that excludes so many people. And I think it was also, I kept volunteering, and my dad sat me down like years later, like, Jessie, you know enough, like you can stop that now. But nobody tells you how long you should volunteer for and how long you should put in that free labor for. It's kind of the expectation, well, they can exploit you if the expectation is that you keep needing to volunteer. So a lot of organizations rely on the fact that you will and you want to build up that experience. But I've been in situations where, like, my job in Madagascar, it was a job, but I paid to work there. Like, I paid for the privilege to work, which is like outrageous if you're in any other industry to pay to have a job. But it's normal in conservation that you'd go to a location and you would like help fund the research station or whatever, and then you would do a lot of hard labor. And what makes me actually really annoyed is I work for a council now as an environmental educator, and I do the least amount of work that I've probably ever done and got paid the most. And it frustrates me so much because I've been on this journey where I've put blood, sweat and tears into everything I do. And now I'm just sitting at a desk typing out emails and I'm actually able to live a viable wage, and it doesn't seem fair, especially in Australia, right? So the job that gets you into conservation is usually planting or weeding or something, like hard yakka work, digging holes. And there's a huge barrier to entry when 1 in 5 Australians have a chronic illness, and they might not be able to go out into the field and do that kind of work. And then also, if you're passionate about restoration work or revegetation, if you want to go up into your career, you end up in an administration role, which is not what you got into the career for, but if you advance in your career, you just end up behind a desk. So there's a lot of things that really need to change, because I don't know, at every point there's a lot of pain.
That's the inclusivity issue, isn't it? I mean, I think, Paul, you also are working in a city university. I mean, we have a lot of students from British Bangladeshi, British Caribbean origin, very good students, very keen on getting into the profession. But living in London, they're immediately excluded when they graduate because they don't drive. And the majority of ecological consultancy jobs require people to have a driving license. And just for a start, and the wages are so low, and it actually costs a lot of money to, I mean, I think learning to drive is quite expensive, and then buying a car and running a car on starter wages. I mean, I've seen some jobs advertised at £21,000. I mean, it is, and then you've got. I mean, admittedly, you don't have to pay your student debt back if you're earning that kind of money, but it's pretty depressing teaching, to be honest, with people coming out to that kind of. That was why I got involved with the level 7 apprenticeship, and stopped teaching and stopped. The MSc I was running has stopped because I'm not prepared to be involved in people running up huge debt and not being able to get adequately paid jobs at the end of it. I would rather put my effort into apprenticeships where people can be working and gain their qualification while they're working. But that's just me. What about, we're not hearing from consultants. Des, where are you?
I'm here. Can we hear from Sarah, because she's had her hand up?
Oh, sorry, who's had their hand up?
Sarah's had her hand up for a while, so are we able to?
Oh, okay, yeah.
Thanks.
Hi, thank you, Jessie. Amazing talk. I feel like I'm watching my own life in some respects there. You get so used to doing the volunteering and not getting any money that it was actually my bank manager, I think I was 31, sat me down when I was applying for a loan to go out and work with some turtles on that amazing golden sandy beach. And he was like, what are you doing? You can't continue. It being called in by your bank manager is a pretty scary experience. And for them to give you a career prep talk and say, you've got to stop having this mentality of volunteering and doing stuff for free and actually get a paid job, it was pretty powerful. And I think when you're surrounded by people all in your situation and doing volunteering, it can be very difficult to step outside and go, wait a second, this isn't what I should be doing anymore, and sort of finding that tipping point. So it's really great to see that your sort of online sort of reach is helping with that. Hopefully people aren't reaching 31.
Well, look, I got my first job at 30 years old, my first full-time job, so that's just the way it goes.
31 when I became a lecturer. I was actually one of the youngest to get it, but I went, because of all the experience I had, I was able to go straight in as a lecturer. So ultimately it probably did have benefit, but it bites you later. For example, pensions, I possibly won't ever work enough to get my state pension. So if you're doing all this volunteering, it can have unexpected negative aspects that you don't necessarily think of at the time as well. Anyway, that was all I wanted to say.
Thanks, Sarah. Yeah, that's so true. And even like, so we have, what is it called? Super in Australia. And I was really worried about that as well. Like, will I ever be able to retire, considering I only started getting super a couple of years ago, or like real contributions to that. And I guess that's why I touched on the financial stress, because I was like so burnt out from life, because so I was like volunteering, but also I had to work to earn money, but also I wasn't in a job that had benefits, so I wasn't contributing to my future. But then also, like, when conservation is your whole life and not just a job, you're like, how do I source my clothes, or what's my diet, and what's all these other things? And it just feels like it's so bewildering, and there's so many compounding factors where it's a kind of niche industry and that is led by passion. And so a lot of sensible things kind of go out the window, or like we have a lot of extra pressure that encompasses more of life than just people who want to be an architect and then they go to school and they become an architect, but they play with Lego on the side and have a life. But there's, yeah. And even like there's a chapter in my book about having relationships in the industry, because one lonely conservationist messaged me saying, hi, Jessie, I'm worried if I get into conservation, I'll never have a partner and I'll never be able to get married, or blah, blah, blah. And it's so sad that people think that they have to sacrifice every part of themselves to make some kind of positive impact on our planet. And I think we have to start integrating our own sustainability in with the sustainability of our natural world, because that's the only way things are going to work. But if everything's so business and job led and exploitation is beneficial to them, that's not the message that they're going to be pushing. So I hope that Lonely Conservationist empowers the community members to advocate for themselves, and then at least they can break that cycle independently, even though I can't change the industry myself. Kamal, you had your hand up.
Hi, Jessie. Good to meet you. Brilliant talk. Really, really fascinating. And to use a phrase that we use in the fellowship, so many similarities. And I was working for nearly 10 years as a volunteer in West London, and sort of around London and outside of London on occasion. It took me a long time to find that paid job, and even then, it was only a minimal wage and an hourly rate, and a 0 hours contract. And so now at the moment I'm at King's College doing a PhD. So hopefully that will add on to the pound thing at the end if I get a job. But yeah, just want to say thanks for your talk, and it's inspirational.
Thank you so much. Do you have a worry that you're going to be overqualified with a PhD? Because this is something that happens a lot with I don't know, I've heard about it with people in Australia, as they get a PhD and then suddenly they're too qualified or too nichely qualified for something, and then they're not welcome anywhere in the workforce because their knowledge is too specific or they're overqualified for jobs.
I'll let you know when I come to that boundary.
Okay, cool. Yeah, Sarah?
That has happened to me. I was applying for forest research jobs and they didn't want to give it to me because I had a PhD, because I said I wouldn't stay. Yeah. And they said I was overqualified. So
despite the fact they employ lots of people with PhDs, Sarah.
I mean, I'm going back a decade now. So
I think it's. I mean, I think it can become a convenient excuse.
They still gave me the job in the end.
Yeah. I was wanting to get an opinion from someone working consultancy, and I'm sorry, Des, it's going to be you, because you're. I mean, what do you feel from that? I know you're not just in consultancy, but I mean, being on the side of seeing broken graduates working in consultancy, but well-known consultancies. What do you think about this culture of 0 hours contracts?
Well, I mean, I'm not a big fan of 0 hours contracts, but I mean, if I could just say something about the volunteering side of things, I mean, the consultancy industry suffers from the same dreadful addiction to the volunteering sort of mantra that conservation does. This idea that it's almost like I mean, a little bit of volunteering is great, obviously, gain a little bit of experience, do some good in your own time. That's great. But it's not supposed to be a substitute for an early career. And that's kind of what it's become. And certainly in consultancy, it's treated like that. When you get applicants coming in, those who volunteered and been through, several years of using their own time, being paid nothing or very little, and volunteering, on paper they can look better because they've had all this experience, and that just encourages the whole system, really. Yeah. So we're sort of vested in it, and we need to break the addiction. So I mean, as far as my company is concerned, we're trying to do that by not offering volunteering positions ourselves, but offering junior posts to people that are paid, and to train people in-house while they're being paid. Easier said than done. It's not the easiest thing to do, but that's what we're trying to do. And we pay students who come on placement, so we're not expecting them to just volunteer their own time. And I think a lot of big consultancies and more progressive consultancies they've seen the light. They know that it's not acceptable, and it really ties in with our sort of wider corporate ethical responsibility, and so on, not to exploit people who are keen to get into this business, and so are kind of vulnerable to that. I would like to also just say, that was a great talk, Jesse, and the bit that resonates most with me really is I didn't spend a long time volunteering and so on, but certainly when I went into my PhD, I felt like a complete imposter, and I did in my sort of early career after that. I came from the wrong background. I didn't go to the right schools and universities and so on. It's tough. It's really tough when you feel that way, and it's just taken years really to build up the confidence that you do actually know, what you're talking about. Confidence that you don't actually care after a while. If people think you don't know what you're talking about, well, actually, I don't really care that much. But it takes a thick skin and a lot of experience, and to be a bit long in the tooth like me to think like that. But I feel your pain, most certainly.
Kamal, you've got your hand up again.
Oh, do I? Apologies,
or is it a legacy hand?
Legacy hand.
It's sometimes surprisingly hard to get your hand down, isn't it? Drew, you're still here.
Yeah, so I'm still here. Yeah, sorry, I started listening and stayed because it was really good actually, Jesse.
All right,
it's just really echoed. A lot of some of my experiences, I think, in the early days of my career, but also a lot of my friends who I graduated with have been in the same situation as you, stuck in that kind of cycle of volunteering and all that kind of thing. So, yeah, really thought-provoking. Hopefully you've seen Laura's comment in the chat there. That's well worth a read as well. That's quite hits you in the heart, doesn't it? Tugging the heartstrings, that one. So that's really good. But yeah, I just want to say, obviously, in terms of the volunteering stuff, interesting what Richard was saying about the consultancy sector still being in that cycle of volunteering as well. It's quite interesting. As a fellow birder, one comment I would make. So, for example, if you're looking for bird surveyors, one thing that I've found consultancies are quite keen on is kind of that demonstration of field ID and that kind of thing, which sometimes is something you can build up from volunteering, which is kind of alludes to what Debbie was saying earlier. Like, if you are going to volunteer, pick your opportunities wisely and think about what you can get out of them towards the end. That would be something I would tell people as a volunteering development officer, is if you are going to volunteer, think very carefully about what the opportunity is for you there. But also, yeah, it's quite interesting that we really need people who can kind of showcase their passion for what they do, and I don't think that should be devalued. I think the most when people can really showcase their passion for what they do, hopefully there wouldn't be a need to volunteer, because they will have got that experience from their free time in pursuing that passion, and be able to show that and show their knowledge through that. So yeah, really interesting. But it's difficult, isn't it? Because it's some areas, particularly in conservation, it's a really competitive sector sometimes, and there is also a lot of that stigma still, I think, going on, particularly people who are currently working in the conservation sector, of to get my job, I had to do this much volunteering, and therefore you must as well. And we do need to change that. So I'm absolutely agreeing. The more opportunities we can get for paid apprenticeships in the sector, the better. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks so much. It's like, I don't know, it just feels like a relentless cycle that's hard to get out of. And I think when I started Lonely Conservationists, I was like, oh my God, all these people are experiencing it too. And there's all these people all over the world. I have to fix the conservation industry myself. And it was like all these, well, because basically everyone's like, I thought I was going to give up on the industry, and that's why I created Lonely Conservationists. I was miserable. And then all of a sudden I have like thousands of people looking at me like, you've identified a problem, like, go on, do something about it. So it was an interesting experience in understanding my capacity to do things in this space as well, because it's really challenging when everybody has their passion, and you have like bird people and seaweed people and bug people, but nobody wants to be like a conservationist person. So every time I've tried to recruit other people to help me in my plight, and in 2020 in lockdown, I was like, cool, this may be an opportunity to get some resources going, or to make Lonely Conservationists a thing, or like a more cohesive organization or something. It's so challenging for me to do that when everybody's so specialized and passionate in the industry, and somebody that's like, life is about ants and they want to save the Peruvian ants and that's what their passion is, they're not going to want to step back and help look at the bigger picture. So I think there's an interesting landscape of conservation as well, because that passion enables people to do so much, but also there's a lot of weird side effects of that passion as well throughout the industry.
Yes, I think that's it's what makes people easy to exploit, isn't it? When it comes down to it, people, as you said, bricklayers. Nobody expects bricklayers to do it for the love of it; they do it for the money. Whereas most of the people working in conservation are actually doing it because they care. And it does make it very different. I'm aware that we've gone over time. We've lost a few people already. I think it might very well be time to say thanks very much, Jessie. And we should stop the recording. And we actually have a committee meeting, which was supposed to start at 7.